Hi, my name is Jayma Mustaine, and this is my case study for Module 12 in EDL 850 School Law. The following provides a factual description of the people and events presented in the case study. Keith Sample is a principal at St. Regis School, and he has worked hard to build a positive climate amongst the staff. Mrs. Lynn is the school's library media specialist, who also serves as the computer laboratory teacher. She has found herself in conflict with Mrs. Brandon, who is a third grade teacher that's concerned about copyright violation. The events are as follows. The PTA was preparing to purchase new software, so Mrs. Lynn worked with the principal and staff to prioritize a list that would meet the needs of the most subjects and grades. Mrs. Lynn ordered new programs for computer lab use and cataloged them with emerging technologies and stored them in the computer lab. Mrs. Lynn then developed a schedule for class computer lab use, which they followed for 4 months before teachers asked for the software to be installed on their classroom computers. Mrs. Lynn made copies of the computer program and distributed them to the third grade teachers. Mrs. Williams was really delighted about this, but Mrs. Brandon was worried about copyright violation. She expressed her concerns to Mrs. Lynn, and Mrs. Lynn became disgruntled and told her that they really needed to stretch every penny. Mrs. Brandon explained her concerns to Mr. Sample, and this was the first he had heard about the copies. Mrs. Brandon told Mr. Sample that she refused the copies, but she knows that other teachers are using them. Mr. Sample went to speak with Mrs. Lynn and saw the stack of CDs on her desk. He asked her about them, and she explained her thoughts to him. Mr. Sample informed her that she is in violation of copyright and needs to collect all the copies, but she argued back that no one will care about copies and explained that the PTA president helped make the copies, pleased with saving the money. After evaluating the situation, there are several ethical and legal issues to consider. The first ethical issue is when the teachers approached Mrs. Lynn and asked her to copy software programs for classroom use. Mrs. Lynn then had a string of unethical and even illegal actions. She began acting unethically when she purchased blank CDs for the purpose of copying them. We can only assume that she knew what she was doing was wrong because she didn't talk to the principal about this. The legal issues arose when she then used those blank CDs to make copies of commercially licensed software programs and distributed them to teachers. I found it unethical for Mrs. Lynn to react the way she did when Mrs. Brandon brought up her concerns about copyright, as well as when she then questioned Mr. Sample after he told her she needed to collect the copies she distributed. Lastly, it was really unethical for Mrs. Lynn to think that the location and size of St. Regis School invalidated the copyright restrictions, stating that no one would care or know. Due to the nature of this, I feel that it's a legal issue. The software company who makes their living selling these programs was harmed as the copying of their product was theft. After teacher requests, Mrs. Lynn is in possible violation of the law, which is vague, but she is in violation of stated copyright restrictions because she knowingly made copies of a purchased software program. And despite a teacher and the principal informing her of this violation, she continues to argue for her actions because she has saved the school money. There's a lot to know about the people and locations involved in the case study. There's Mr. Keith Sample, who has been the principal at St. Regis School for 3 years. He did not grow up in this rural town, but he has worked hard to gain supporters on the staff and in the community. Mrs. Lynn is the library media specialist, and we don't know how long that she has been teaching or staffed at St. Regis. Mrs. Williams is a third grade teacher who has always taught at St. Regis. She was provided a copy of the software, which she was delighted to receive. Mrs. Brandon is the other third grade teacher who has 3 years of experience, but this is her first year at St. Regis. Due to the protocols at her last school, she is very concerned about copyright violations. Mrs. Evans is also a part of this case study. She is the PTA president and volunteered in the library. She helped Mrs. Lynn make the software copies and was pleased to see the funds being stretched. When considering the information provided regarding the places, we know this case took place at St. Regis School. We don't know much about the location, except that it is in a rural area located 25 miles outside of a larger city. When students graduate from this school, they are then bused to the city for high school. The school is comprised of approximately 420 students and has a limited budget. The school works to gain funds by holding 2 major fundraising efforts each year. Since the school is small, there are only 2 teachers per grade level. It has 2 special education teachers, one for kindergarten through 4th grade and another for 4th through 8th grade. We know very little about the program. We know it's a K through 8 school and can assume it's public since it receives state allocated funds. There's no other information regarding this. Due to the actions displayed by all, there are multiple potential damages to evaluate, as well as who the decision will affect and what additional information is needed in order to make a decision. Possible damages are that Mrs. Lynn could be found in violation of copyright laws, which would bring consequences for St. Regis School, the school district, and Mrs. Lynn, possibly teachers who used those copies knowing that they were copyright violated. Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Sample, the school district, students, parents all have a stake in the outcome. Mrs. Lynn because she could face serious consequences. Mrs. Williams because she's knowingly using this copy of a commercially licensed program. Mr. Sample because he oversees the actions of these teachers and could face consequences because of the violations within his school. The school district because they oversee the school and might have to face consequences for the school's actions. And then parents and students are caught in the middle of all of this, and what happens in this will affect them no matter what. So what more I could know are what are the district's parameters for computer software use? What does the software's copyright page state about their licensing restrictions? And then in these restrictions, are there provisions that talk about fair use policy? It is important to analyze all actions that could be taken along with their possible consequences. I could take no action, allowing use of the copied programs within classrooms throughout the school. The possible consequences of not doing anything are that more teachers may begin using the copies. The number of violations will grow, and the school, the district, and Mrs. Lynn will then face serious consequences. Another action could be to terminate Mrs. Lynn, collect all the copies, and set strict policing of software. This could result in the students being without a library media specialist and computer laboratory teacher until another one is found. This could also upset the PTA as well as teachers that I've worked hard to create a positive relationship with. There's also the action of moving forward to ensure that all copies are collected and no more are made, allowing Mrs. Lynn to stay on staff. The consequences of this might be that it upsets teachers to take the copies away and to upset Mrs. Lynn. Lastly, I could choose to sit down with Mrs. Lynn and review the software's licensing restrictions. But if this is the only action I take, it could lead to teachers continuing to use the copied programs because they're not collected, and then the school and the district could still face serious consequences. So the consequences that come with both options that still remove the copies are that the students are going to have less access to the programs than they do with the extra copies currently in their classrooms. After identifying the possible actions, we need to look at the pros and cons of each action. The first option is to do nothing more. I've told Mrs. Lynn what she needs to do, and she can determine to follow my directions or not. The pros of this option are that the PTA dollars are stretched to help all students and teachers, as well as the increased student use of the latest technology available in the school. This option comes with a lot of cons, as it is violating copyright restrictions and policy, and even possibly the law. This puts multiple teachers in a morally questionable situation as they are violating copyright for knowingly using copies of these commercially licensed programs. The use of these copies could lead to severe consequences for the school district, and Mrs. Lynn. This option also models really poor ethics. The second possible course of action would be to do the opposite. Fire Mrs. Lynn for her actions, remove all copies of the software program, and set strict policing of software use. This would remove the cause of the issue and ensure that there would be no consequences for the school or district for a copyright violation, because I would be able to collect and destroy all copies, as well as make sure it does not happen again. The cons are that in doing this, something so drastic, I could lose the trust of the staff as well as the PTA. This could leave the school without a library media specialist or a computer laboratory teacher until she's replaced, and the students' exposure to the software would be restricted. A Apart from doing nothing or terminating Mrs. Lin, I could review the software licensing restrictions with Mrs. Lin, then collect and destroy the copies. In doing this, I would also work toward policy change by ensuring the school has a clearly stated policy regarding copyright. This would allow myself and Mrs. Lin to understand the laws and why the CDs need to be removed. Another pro of this choice is that there would be no severe consequences to face for Mrs. Lin, the school, or the district. The cons of this option are that it could still possibly upset teachers to not have classroom software use, as well as the PTA for not stretching their funds. As mentioned earlier, it would also restrict software use to only the computer lab. After evaluating the situation and all options of action, I believe that option 3 is my best choice. Sitting down with Mrs. Lin to review the software's written restrictions ensures adherence to the guidelines, policies, restrictions, and laws. It helps to communicate to her why this removal of the CDs is a big deal, no matter the size or location of the school. This is a detrimental step to ensure adherence to laws, policies, and regulations, as well as a step to ensure it does not happen again. This option allows Mrs. Lin to keep her job. Without her, the school or the district facing extreme consequence. This choice sets an ethical and moral example for all, which promotes the personal well-being of all students and adults. Taking the copied programs out of the classrooms also opens the door for teachers to collaborate and pursue new creative approaches to meeting student needs. There's a lot that can be done away from a computer to ensure the academic success of all children. Staff can engage in collaborative efforts to influence student achievement by creating challenging conditions conducive to diverse student needs. Once I have evaluated all options and chosen the best plan, I will work to implement this in my school. In order to communicate policies, laws, regulations, and procedures regarding copyright, I would begin by finding the specific software program's licensing restrictions and review it with Mrs. Lin, ensuring her understanding of what is allowed and what is not, as well as ensuring she is aware of the consequences for violating these restrictions. Once this has been done, I would reach out to an individual at the district level to inform them this happened and ensure that I am taking the correct steps as I move forward. I would work with them to review the contracts and seek advice from legal if the contract does not mention what to do if an employee violates copyright restrictions. These steps could lead to Mrs. Lin being written up for her violation. With the district guidance, I would then collect all CDs that were distributed and then work to ensure all staff work to adhere to the laws, policies, and regulations by holding a professional development session with the purpose of communicating copyright laws, policies, and procedures. Apart from the previous steps listed, it is my duty to resume my job as normal, continuing to cultivate relationships with staff, students, and the community, holding all to a high expectation by monitoring adherence to all policies, procedures, and laws. If it was not already included, I would ensure the school has a specific policy relating to copyright. The situation opens the doors for leaders in education to reflect in order to learn from mistakes. As a future school leader, I would work to stay away from similar situations by ensuring all staff participate in annual copyright training. I would not stop there, but also clearly communicate consequences for copyright violations. I would set specific and clear guidelines for following all laws, policies, and procedures. Guidelines would include staff communicating their ideas, asking for permission rather than forgiveness. I would work to create a strong relationship with all staff to ensure they feel comfortable coming to me with questions and concerns. I would also implement electronic permissions with all programs, only allowing approved software to be operated on school property computers, with no access to download or copy these programs. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can find me at jamustang@mail.fhsu.edu.